Welcome to the 18th Annual Durfee Lecture, hosted by the Department of Philosophy and Religion at American University. My name is Jin Park. I'm William Fraser McDowell Chair, Professor, and also Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. The Annual Durfee Lecture was established by the generous donation by Harold and Doris Durfee. Dr. Durfee was a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, and upon his retirement, he donated a fund so that he can establish this annual lecture series in which we invite distinguished scholars in the field of religious studies and then give an opportunity to AU community to learn from the ideas of distinguished scholar. Today we have the honor of welcoming Professor Mary Dunn, who will speak on disability and care, among other topics, within the context of Catholicism. So I hope that you enjoy her talk, and then after the talk, there will be a time for the Q&A. At this point, I would like to invite my colleague, Dr. Nick Buck, who is the Director of Undergraduate Studies in Religious Studies, who will officially introduce our speaker, and after talk, he will also moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Jen. Welcome, everyone. It's so good to see you. I love that this is a full room, almost standing room only. Quite honored to welcome and introduce to you our Durfee Lecture this evening, our 18th, I believe, Durfee Lecture. This year our lecturer is Dr. Mary Dunn, professor in the Department of Theological Studies at St. Louis University. Dr. Dunn is the author of several books, including The Cruelest of All Mothers, Marie de l'Incarnation, Motherhood in the Christian Tradition, Fordham University Press in 2016, Intimacies, Intersubjectivity and the Formation of the Religious Subject in the Modern Christian West, Indiana, 2020, and most recently, which I understand connects to some of the themes of today's lecture, Where Paralytics Walk and the Blind See, Narratives of Sickness and Disability at the Juncture of Worlds, from Princeton in 2022, which, I might add, won the American Academy of Religion's 2023 Book Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion, Historical Studies. She is currently at work on a new book project focusing on the history of Quebec's 19th century foundlings and the Augustinian nuns who cared for them. Along with her teaching and research, Dr. Dunn directs the Center for Research on Global Catholicism at St. Louis University. Please join me in providing a warm welcome to Mary Dunn.
Thank you, Dr. Buck and Dr. Park. Such a generous welcome, and it's a true honor to be here tonight. And I had the pleasure already of meeting several of you students earlier today for tea and some in the halls, and I will say that I've been so impressed by American University students, and I'm so happy to have you all here. So my talk tonight is called Vital Signs, Disability, History, and the Catholic Imagination. I'm one of two children. My older brother is a doctor. He works in the emergency room at the Veterans Hospital in the city of St. Louis. Most days he saves someone's life. He knows how to reverse an overdose and how to defibrillate a heart. That is a hard word to say when you are a humanities scholar. He knows how to treat a gunshot wound and how to ventilate a patient in respiratory distress. He's useful. He makes a difference. Our mother's retired now, but for decades, she was a teacher in the public schools. She taught hundreds, maybe thousands of kids how to add and subtract, how to write their names, how to read. She changed lives. She did good. And me, how do I spend my time? Well, I think, and on good days I write, about the Catholic past. You know where this is going. I pore over musty manuscripts, accessible only in minor archives. I study obscure tomes that have to be special ordered through interlibrary loan. I read critical theory, and I read critiques of critique. Lately, I've been building a spreadsheet of abandoned babies long forgotten, most of whom died before they could walk or talk. It has taken me months. I channel a lot of my mental energy into thinking about thinking and writing about writing and wrestling with multisyllabic concepts like epistemology and historiography that mean little, if anything, outside of the academy. And twice a week, I try to convince 28 undergraduates and late adolescents that these things matter. But as the young folks say, I'm not gonna lie. There was a time, a long time, when I wondered whether these things really did matter. Most days I simply pressed on, lured by the spectacle of the Catholic past, driven by a hungry curiosity, and satisfied by the intellectual delight I took in my research. Plus, I was good at it. Periodically, though, the shadow of doubt would darken and grow, and I'd ask myself what on earth I was doing with my time. What was the point? Did my work matter? Why did it matter? And to whom? Was it important? Was it valuable? Worth my while? What difference did any of it make? I have a friend who is a scholar of Syriac Christianity who tells me it's enough for him that he enjoys his work and excels at it. And I wish I felt that way, but I don't. I enjoy my work, and by most accounts I excel at it. But when the hungry need feeding and the naked need clothing, these convenient truths do not, for me, possess sufficient force to dispel the cloud of suspicion that my time might be better spent doing things of obvious and immediate value. Zena Hitz, in her wonderful book, Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of the Intellectual Life, describes being, quote, haunted by the prospect of uselessness as a graduate student in philosophy. The suffering world cries out to be fixed, Hitz writes. How can we choose the intellectual life over a life of action? How can we spare time to contemplate, if that means lost lives and livelihoods through inactivity? Exactly. How can we? As if the examples of my close kin were not enough to periodically catalyze a cascade of self-doubt, as a historian of Catholicism, I often regularly encounter in my own scholarly research historical figures who had so clearly made concrete and discernible differences in the world. Take, for instance, Martin of Porres, the Peruvian lay brother renowned for serving the poor and healing the sick in 17th century Lima. Or, the subject of my first book, the Ursuline mystic Marie de l'Incarnation, who left behind everything she knew, including her own son, to traverse an ocean to found a school for indigenous girls in Quebec. Or, more recently, Sister St. John Fournier, who came to St. Louis in 1837 from France to teach deaf children and later devoted herself to educating the daughters of formerly enslaved Black Americans. Against the historical parade of holy people like these, how indeed can we, could I, justify having chosen the intellectual life over a life of action? It's enough to make you whip off those little white cotton archive gloves in despair. But I realized something recently, something I could not have realized back in 2008 when I joined the professoriate, nor even in 2017 when I finally earned tenure. Something that became clearly visible to me only against the horizon of certain accelerating historical trends. What I realized was this, that the intellectual life is a response, an effective and powerful response to the suffering world that, as Hitz puts it, cries out to be fixed. But how can this be? How is it that the intellectual life alleviates suffering? Deep thoughts never put food on anybody's table. Great books never paid the rent on the first of the month. Suffering, though, comes in many stripes. Human beings need more than food and shelter and medical care, and more than good jobs and safe streets. We also need the nourishment that leisure provides, the freedom to daydream and wander and wonder, the space within which we can revel in what Hitz calls the splendid uselessness of pursuing an activity for its own sake. Such things are in short supply these days. The world has become noisier, faster, busier, more measured and mapped and micromanaged, and so have we. Against this horizon, the intellectual life emerges as a countercultural force, drawing us toward depth in a world of surface attractions, dwelling on the qualitative in a world bent on quantification, insisting on the slow and the serious in a world sold on speed and dopamine hits. It's not too much to say that against this horizon, the intellectual life is, or at its best can be, a vital intervention in a suffering world. But because I am a historian of Catholicism, and because I'm here tonight to give the Durfee Lecture at the invitation of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at American University, I want to think specifically tonight about the contributions of scholarship on the history of religions to the broader project of the intellectual life as a life-saving response to the suffering world. And to do so, I want to draw on my own area of expertise, which is early modern Catholic history, and my recent work on disability in French Catholic Canada. I want to explain to you how the questions that drove this work, questions about the semantics of disability, questions about the contingency of narratives, questions about meaning and creativity and the limits of the imagination, were born from a particular kind of suffering, and how the research to which they gave rise was in very real and immediate ways life-saving for me. I am the mother of 4 children, 3 wonderful boys and a beautiful, lively, hilarious little girl named Aggie. Aggie was born in June 2012, and in December of that year, she received a diagnosis of a rare chromosomal microdeletion, a genetic irregularity that contemporary American medical culture registers as disability. For Aggie, the diagnosis made no difference. She was who she was. She was already the seed of who she would become, quick to laughter, full of energy, deeply affectionate. But for us, for my husband and me, and the boys were too young, the diagnosis landed like a bomb, exploding all that we had imagined for our family and everything we had predicted about the future. You need to reset your expectations for this child, said the neurologist who delivered the news. And then she pointed us toward the hospital cafe and told us to get a snack. What followed from there over the course of the years was an endless stream of appointments with all kinds of medical professionals, with the phlebotomist, the cardiologist, the neurologist, the geneticist, the audiologist, the ophthalmologist, and tests and evaluations of various sorts, echocardiograms, kidney ultrasounds, hearing tests, speech evaluations, educational assessments, and hours of therapy with the PT, the OT, the speech pathologist, the vision therapist, and a number of educational specialists. I was and still am profoundly grateful for the expertise and the interventions provided by these experts. And I was and am beyond grateful for the programs and resources made available to Aggie and for my family's ability to navigate them. But it was exhausting. It was suffocating. It was alienating. And it was also clear to me by that point that in my world, in our world, where healthcare is big business and biomedicine reigns supreme, disability was a problem in need of a solution. Disability scholar Leonard Davis traces the idea of disability as a problem in need of a solution to the 19th century and the emergence of the concept of the norm. Whether a side effect of the scientific revolution or its industrial counterpart, or some entanglement between the two, the category of the normal came gradually to define the contours of what counted as disability. Bodies that couldn't or wouldn't conform to normative type frustrated modernity's expectations of efficiency, order, and controlled predictability, not to mention the demands of industrial labor that fit people into factories like parts into a machine. By the mid-19th century, Davis argues, disability had emerged as a problem in need of a solution. The problem was abnormality. The solutions proposed in various ways to engineer a return to normality. Rehabilitation, surgeries, therapies, and most recently genetic modifications. All these were and are the means by which disability in the modern West was and is treated. I didn't yet know this history back in 2012, but I felt, in ways that became increasingly intolerable to me, the heavy weight of this monolithic biomedical narrative. Each excruciating, audiology test I sat through with an infant Aggie on my lap was a reminder that she didn't hear like a normal child. Each fine motor evaluation Aggie endured, struggling to thread one plastic bead after another, became an occasion for yet another set of stats that told me just how far she was from the developmental standard. Eventually, I had enough of the subtle and sometimes not so subtle message that disability was a problem, that the best we could hope for was to mitigate it, conceal it, or maybe even, one day, eradicate it thanks to the wonders of genetic engineering. I was tired of the plotline that figured disability as the central conflict of a life. I wanted alternatives. I wanted to tell and I wanted to live a different kind of story about disability, a counter-narrative, a story that was not at its core about fixing what had gone wrong. Because Aggie herself had not gone wrong. She wasn't a problem. She didn't need a solution. She needed cultivation and patience and loving singular attention, just like her brothers. And we, needed a narrative that didn't limit the measure of a life to the rule of a norm. And so I went looking, in search of alternative narrative templates for making sense of disability. I could have looked to the arts, to memoir, to sci-fi, to critique. But because I'm a historian of Catholicism, because I spend many of my waking hours playing in the vast sandbox of the early modern Catholic past, I turned there to that world for sources to think with. The result was my 2022 book, Where Paralytics Walk in the Blind See, Narratives of Sickness and Disability at the Juncture of Worlds. This was a book born from a particular experience of suffering, one that made life less livable, more cramped, more confined, more compressed. I needed a way out of the story that disability was a problem in need of a solution. I wanted this for Aggie. I wanted this for me. And I wanted this for everyone, because sooner or later, most of us will, if we haven't already, have a close and perhaps lasting encounter with disability. And this is what disability scholars and activists mean by invoking the term TAB, temporarily able-bodied, to refer to those among us living without disabilities, for now. The point is, disability is not, in fact, abnormal, but a profoundly normal, ordinary, and typical human experience. Where Paralytics Walk in the Blind See is a historical study. It's an inquiry into the meanings made of what I call in the book embodied difference in early modern Catholic Canada under the French regime. In pursuit of semantic alternatives that configure disability other than a problem in need of a solution, I asked after the meanings made of impairment in early modern New France, which is, you can see in this map here, that area of North America annexed to the French Empire from the mid-16th century to 1763, when New France fell to the British. So my questions were, how was disability imagined in Canada under the French regime? What did it signify for those mostly Catholic men and women clustered along the St. Lawrence River Valley? Under what circumstances, and within which contexts? To answer these questions, I turned to a diverse range of primary source texts dating to between 1632 and 1751. The first, a series of annual journals written and edited by Jesuit missionaries laboring in eastern Canada, known as the Jesuit Relations. The second, a monastic chronicle composed collaboratively by the Augustinian nuns employed as nurses in this hospital, the Hôtel Dieu, in Quebec, which was the first hospital in the Americas north of Mexico. The third source was a biography or a hagiography, which just means writings on the saints, a hagiography of one of these nursing nuns who worked at the Hôtel Dieu, the Venerable Catherine de Saint Augustine, written by her Jesuit confessor. And finally, a set of 21 accounts of miraculous healing attributed to a really obscure Recollect, which is a branch of the Franciscans, friar named Didas Pelletier, and forwarded to Rome in support of his canonization. So what I want to do now is turn to one of those 21 miracles attributed to the intercessions of this Recollect friar, Frère Didas, as an example of a story about disability told in this early modern French Catholic context. This story, I will argue, does not configure disability as a problem in need of a solution. In this story, disability is made to signify otherwise. So the story goes like this. I'm going to read it to you in its entirety, and I have used ChatGPT to help me with some images that might bring this story to life in hopefully a kind of funny way. Okay, here's the story. I, the undersigned, Charles Glandelet, canon theologian in Quebec and vicar general of the most illustrious and most reverend bishop of Quebec, certify that today, on the 22nd day of October 1699, having been sent by Monsignor to the convent of the Ursulines, an order of nuns, in Quebec to determine the truth of the things that were reported regarding an extraordinary cure, received from Sister Rose of St. Catherine, aged 25, the following testimony in the presence of Mother Superior Marie des Anges and others. Sister Rose declared that she had suffered since the age of 8 a partial paralysis in her right arm caused by a fall on the ice. The paralysis caused her great discomfort, which got worse over time despite the various remedies she applied to ameliorate the impairment. Indeed, last winter she found herself so incapacitated by the arm that she almost couldn't use it at all and went to consult Monsieur Sarrazin, the medical doctor, which is right there. Monsieur Sarrazin examined her arm thoroughly and determined it would be very difficult to heal such an inveterate impairment by ordinary means, which determination provoked another nun, Sister St. Paul, to advise Sister Rose to appeal to the prayers and intercession of Frère Didas, who had died in their hospital in the town of Trois-Rivières in February with the reputation of having been a great servant of God. Sister St. Paul told Sister Rose stories of some cures that were said to have happened through the intercession of Frère Didas. Sister Rose testified that at first she dismissed Sister Paul's advice, insisting that she only put her trust in saints who had been canonized. But shortly after, her arm began to cause her such extraordinary discomfort and unusual pain that she concluded she was being punished for her disbelief and was inspired to invoke Frère Didas with confidence. She proposed as much to her uncle, Father Joseph Denis, who was at that time superior of the Recollects in Quebec, reporting to him what had happened. He confirmed her interpretation that her worsened condition had been caused by her disbelief and approved her intention to appeal to Frère Didas for a cure. Father Joseph advised her to say the Obsecro prayer, a prayer in honor of the Holy Virgin that Frère Didas recited daily. She followed his advice, and having said this prayer for 15 days, felt the pain and the discomfort in her arm notably diminished. She reported these results to Father Joseph, who then brought her a pocket rosary that had once belonged to Frère Didas. Sister Rose placed the pocket rosary on her arm in the spot where it hurt the most and kept it there for an additional 15 days, over the course of which she felt better and better. Finally, at the end of the 30 days, she was so perfectly cured that not only has she had no pain since, but experienced more strength and vigor in her right arm than her left, such that she used her right arm immediately after without an ounce of pain to carry out the most arduous tasks, like the laundry and other similar things. She has continued to perform such tasks since the time of her cure till today without experiencing the least discomfort. This is the testimony of Sister Rose de St. Catherine, declared and attested to on this day and year in my presence and in the presence of the religious women above named, in faith of which she signed and I signed, as well as the religious women who were witnesses to the present declaration. So, that's the end of the story. So what do we notice about it? First of all, it's framed as a legal discourse, a formal deposition given by Sister Rose in the presence of witnesses, including the representative of the highest ecclesiastical authority in the city of Quebec. This is very common to miracle narratives, especially those that were forwarded to Rome in support of canonization. The truth of what Sister Rose reported was established with the support of the law and the confirmation of the institutional church. Second, the impairment of which Sister Rose complained, this partially paralyzed right arm, was disabling. It caused her great pain and prevented her from doing those things which were required of her, things we learn by the end of the story, like the laundry. Third, the doctor, Monsieur Sarrazin, can do nothing about it. The disabling impairment, he affirms, is too old and too durable and can't be fixed by medical intervention. In this feature, This miracle story, like so many others, not just in this collection of 21, but all over the Catholic tradition, shows the doctor playing a key role in the diagnosis of the impairment as incurable. There's nothing to be done, no remedy, no chance, no hope. The doctor's impotence vis-a-vis the disabling impairment functions as a foil to the miracle working power of the saint, which we see later. Fourth, the possibility that Sister Rose might have recourse to Frere Didas is suggested to her by another nun. Sister St. Paul had got wind of Frere Didas's intercessory powers. She'd heard stories before about his ability to cure and to heal. Already before Sister Rose's disabled arm was healed through the intercession of Frere Didas, there were rumors, whispers, tales of his wonder-working powers. The story of Sister Rose's cure is part of a broader narrative tradition, one node in an interlocking network of stories that bolsters claims of Frere Didas's sanctity in particular, and the possibility of miraculous healing against the ordinary course of nature in general. Fifth, Sister Rose is punished by Frere Didas for having rejected Sister St. Paul's suggestion. This narrative feature, too, is a familiar one in the genre of miracle stories. There are plenty of stories in the Catholic past about saints punishing skeptics for their disbelief. In this particular story, Sister Rose's skepticism does two things. First, it establishes Sister Rose's orthodoxy and obedience vis-a-vis the authority of the institutional church. She wouldn't dare appeal to a holy man who hadn't yet been confirmed by the church as a saint. Second, it enables Frere Didas to exercise his miracle-working powers, powers that in this instance make the disabling impairment worse, not better, and thus functions to anticipate the miraculous healing to come. Sixth, Sister Rose, again demonstrating her deference to ecclesiastical authority, appeals to Father Joseph, the superior of the Recollects in Quebec, who also happened to be Sister Rose's uncle, asking that he approve her intention to appeal to Frere Didas for a cure. In this narrative detail, we can see again the profoundly social foundations upon which sanctity, and indeed the interpretation of a particular event as miraculous, rests. Father Joseph had a vested interest in promoting the canonization of Frere Didas. To do so, to prove that Frere Didas was a saint who deserved to be formally recognized by the Church, he needed to provide evidence of a miracle. It's therefore no coincidence that Father Joseph would have encouraged Sister Rose, his niece, to appeal to Frere Didas. Seventh, Sister Rose, at the suggestion of Father Joseph, embarks on a 30-day process intended to facilitate the intercession of Frere Didas and effectuate the cure of this paralyzed arm. She repeats daily one of Frere Didas's favorite prayers, and she borrows his pocket rosary, which counts in this case as a second-class relic, so something that had touched his body, and she places it on her impaired arm. So here I want you to note the layering of these ritual practices and this accumulation of time. There's a lot of excess in these stories. Then finally, Sister Rose gets her cure, and after the end of 30 days, her disabled arm, the one that had troubled her since childhood, and again, the duration of the impairment is important to this story, another instance of this excess, is fully mobile. Her arm has been restored to full functioning, and not only that, but we're told that it's stronger and better than ever. Again, excess. She's able to do the laundry now, among other tasks, and has had no more pain since. The way this story ends is no surprise. Most stories of miraculous cures in the broader Catholic tradition end with this, the perfection of the cure and its permanence. So again, this kind of overabundance of cure. Not just the pain is gone, but it's better than ever, and it never came back. So, when I first encountered this miracle story and the others like it in the collection attributed to Frere Didas, I was stumped and I was disappointed. On its face, it seemed to me that the story of Sister Rose was just another, albeit earlier, variation on this narrative plot that figures disability as a problem in need of a solution. Granted, in the story of Sister Rose, the authority of the medical doctor is explicitly overridden. Dr. Sarrazin can do nothing about the paralyzed arm. But modern biomedicine aside, isn't the story still ultimately about fixing the problem of the disabled body? The cast of characters might be different. Here, the saint substitutes for the physician. Here, prayer and pocket rosaries stand in for therapies and medications and surgical interventions. But doesn't the story both begin and end in the ways we've been led to expect? With the undesirability of disability and its triumphant effacement? If I had turned to the early modern French Catholic past in search of alternatives to the dominant narrative template of my own time and place, had I actually found one? Or had I only discovered that this narrative pattern went deeper than I'd thought? We could, to be sure, read the story of Sister Rose this way. Many scholars in the field of disability studies have interpreted and critiqued miracle stories along these lines. But there's another way to read the story of Sister Rose and her paralyzed arm, one that requires a shift in perspective away from the disability and toward instead the way disability gestures here to something beyond itself. In this story, disability is made to matter within this broader context of the hagiographic tradition. And remember, hagiography just means the tradition of writing about the saints. Here in this story, disability, its presence, its durability, its resistance to medical intervention, is invoked in this story not for its own sake, but as an invitation to the intercession of Frere Didas, and its disappearance, perfect and permanent, summoned as proof of the holy man's sanctity and the possibility of divine intercession on earth. That is to say, the story of Sister Rose is not really or not ultimately a story of disability effaced. The point is not that the problem of Sister Rose's paralyzed arm was solved, that she was restored to functionality, that she can now use her arm and do the laundry. The point is rather that God appears through and in the midst of the mundane world, dependent upon Sister Rose's impaired arm, her social networks, and the medium of layered devotional practices. The story of Sister Rose and the collection of miracle tales in which it's embedded is essentially concerned with making God real, and only incidentally concerned with disability, which functions in this story and others like it, first to summon and then to signify God's presence through the medium of its own effacement. So read in this light, the story of Sister Rose does offer an alternative to the dominant cultural narrative that figures disability as a problem to be solved. What's more, it takes its place in a broader hagiographic tradition in which disability is differentially conceived. When you actually start looking, disability is everywhere in the lives of the saints. Sometimes, as in the story of Sister Rose, disability functions to invoke and then dramatize divine intercession through the figure of the saint. Sometimes, instead, disability is figured as a symptom of sanctity, as the acquired outcome of some kind of preternatural piety or the natural consequence of virtue exercised to a heroic degree. So take, for instance, Benedict Lebray, the 18th century itinerant holy man who prayed so constantly on his knees that they became ulcerous and tumorous, causing him great pain and a lasting limp. In cases like these, disability is actually an index of sanctity, a mark of holiness, a badge, you might say, of honor, not a problem to be solved, but a distinction worth admiring, perhaps even imitating. Sometimes in the lives of the saints, disability is rendered not the consequence of sanctity, but its cause, as in, for example, the life of the Mohawk saint Kateri Tekakwitha, whose visual impairment and facial disfigurement, the latter of which was a consequence of the smallpox epidemic that killed her mother, are interpreted by her Jesuit hagiographer, for better or worse, as having enabled her cultivation of the Christian virtues of modesty, humility, and chastity. In other cases, and here again we have Catherine of St. Augustine, in other cases, disability is made meaningful in the lives of the saints as an experience of embodiment that enables intimate identification with the crucified Christ. So take, for instance, the life of Catherine of St. Augustine, this hospital nun that worked in the Hotel Dieu in Quebec. Her own Jesuit hagiographer makes much of Catherine's extraordinary body. Tormented, abused, chronically ill, always in pain, and unusually receptive to these profoundly disabling visions that were both divine and demonic. This Jesuit hagiographer makes this body of Catherine of St. Augustine's meaningful as the very grounds of her identity as a saint whose story was just a variation on Christ's own. My point here is this. In the hagiographic tradition alone, we have a rich spectrum of narrative alternatives to the plot line that figures disability as a problem to be solved. Disability in the lives of the saints is many things. It's an invitation to divine intercession. It's an index of sanctity. It's an incitement to virtue. It's imitation of Christ. We could add to this narrative diversity by engaging in close readings of other early modern Catholic texts too. The annual reports, those Jesuit relations composed by the Jesuits at work in the mission fields of New France, where disability is made meaningful, again, for better or worse, as the handmaid of mission. The monastic chronicle written collaboratively by the nuns of the Hôtel Dieu, where disability is figured as the grounds of sanctification through service, and many, many more beyond the specific context of French North America. But I think I've made my case. What remains to be clarified is what we do with these counter-narratives of disability, or what they do or can do for us. So I went searching for alternatives to the dominant cultural narrative that rendered disability a problem in need of a solution. I did so, as I said earlier, because I was suffocating under the weight of this biomedical behemoth that more than once, to be clear, saved Aggie's life, but also exacted a price for the ways in which it insisted upon flattening Aggie and my experience as her mother into a shape I couldn't recognize. In digging around in the Catholic past for available counter-narratives, my aim was not to harvest long-gone lessons for application in the present. My intention was not to go backward to some imagined Catholic utopia where disability meant something better. To be clear, I don't think the Catholic past was better. I don't think Sister Rose or the Jesuits or the nuns of the Hôtel Dieu did make sense of disability in ways that were on balance more life-giving. There is something really confining and compressing and even death-dealing about these old Catholic stories that bring concepts of sin and providence and punishment to bear on representations of disability, that marshal disability as a medium for summoning and then signifying the presence of God, that tie disability to suffering, and then suffering to the cultivation of virtue. The meanings made of disability in the early modern Catholic past no doubt pressed down hard upon real people who struggled to live and to flourish within their given worlds. The storyline that constitutes disability as a problem in need of a solution does a disservice to the variety of ways in which disability really is and could be experienced. But the storylines that contextualize disability within the horizons of the hagiographic tradition and Catholicism writ large are no less oppressive, no less violent even. So, what do we do with these counter-narratives of disability offered up by the early modern past? And what can they do for us? If I wasn't going to use these stories dredged up from the 17th and 18th century Catholic Canada to make meaning of my own encounter with disability, then how exactly was this research, as I have argued, life-saving for me in very real and immediate ways? The stories told by the likes of Sister Rose, the Jesuits, and the nuns of the Hôtel Dieu were not better, but they were different. They offered alternative narrative templates for making sense of disability. Not ones I wanted to live out, but ones whose mere existence in all their alterity operated as powerful reminders that human experience, including the experience of disability, can always be made to signify differently. In bringing the contemporary biomedical narrative that figures disability as a problem to be solved into collision with these other kinds of stories, I had managed to relativize the former, not as the final word on disability or the truth about disability, but as one among many historically contingent ways of making disability meaningful within the context of a life. So I don't know about you, but for me, it's easy to be lulled into thinking that we moderns live outside of time in a sense, that we're somehow closer to the truth now, that here in the present we can actually see things as they really are. It's easy, for instance, to see how misguided Galen was about the balance of the body's humors, or how silly Catholics were to think relics could cure disease. But one of history's most valuable lessons, one of its most precious insights, is that we too, with all of our medical breakthroughs and our technologies and our therapies and our theories, will one day be the laughingstock of the future. Maybe that terrifies you, or maybe instead it comforts you, even delights you, as it does me. But what's so comforting, what's so delighting about facing up to the contingencies of our own certainties? It's the corollary that we have way more creative freedom to make sense of ourselves and our world than we thought we did, given the blinders of the present. Juxtaposed against what contemporary biomedicine tells us is the truth about disability. The stories told by Sister Rose, the Jesuits, and the nuns of the Hôtel Dieu. Stories of miracles and virtue, conversion and redemption, suffering and sanctity, operate as potent reminders that all narrative representations of disability, even ours, are historical accidents, dependent on the particularities of discrete life worlds, relations of power, discursive forms, dominant epistemologies. This is not to say that bodies are infinitely malleable or that disability is just constructed, but only that these durable material facts of embodiment can always be made to signify otherwise. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, writes Joan Didion in the famous opening lines of her 1979 book of essays, The White Album. We interpret what we see, and we select the most workable of the multiple choices. Indeed, we do. But sometimes, the range of available choices is so limited, it hurts. Sometimes the stories we tell about all kinds of things, including disability, are so cramped, the spectrum of narrative templates so narrow, that it makes living not easier, but harder. It was with the intention of stretching the range of available grammars for telling stories about disability that I wrote Where Paralytics Walk in the Blind Sea. I wrote that book. I did that research in order to live. So by way of concluding, I want to go back to where I began, kind of zooming out again, with the claim that the intellectual life is, or at its best can be, an intervention, a vital intervention in a suffering world, and with some final thoughts on the contributions of scholarship on the history of religions to that broader project. So it's no secret that traditional religion is appealing to the kids these days. And there's reasons for this. Some say it's the stability that ancient institutions and ritual practices afford a generation adrift in the anomie of the digiverse. Others say it's the comfort of belonging to a community with roots both broad and deep. Still others say it's the assurance that there really are such things as the good, the beautiful, and the true. Traditional religion, it said, offers meaning and purpose in a world starved for something more than commodity culture and the global marketplace can provide. You may agree or disagree with the diagnosis. You may approve or disapprove of the remedy, but it is hard to argue with the claim that the return to traditional religion is symptomatic of a kind of suffering particular to our historical moment. But what exactly are we suffering from? The Nick Fuenteses and the Richard Dawkinses of the world tell us that the problem is too much difference, too much liberalism, too much democracy, too much diversity. And the solution? A return to some semblance of sameness, homogeneity, and rational control. But there are good reasons to suspect that the problem is precisely the opposite, that the problem is actually too little difference, too much sameness, too much predictability, and not nearly enough room for the human imagination to run wild and dream big. Scholarship on the history of religions, at its best, acts as an irritant to a contemporary culture careening toward the compression of the human imagination. I've shared with you this evening some fruits of my own research that in quite explicit ways was intended as a vital intervention in a suffering world. Research that aimed quite deliberately to resist the imaginative stenosis of contemporary figurations of disability, mostly biomedical, and to pump fresh air into the semantics of embodied difference by bringing to bear the rich resources of the Catholic past. But the research I shared this evening is just one tiny example of what scholarship in the history of religions can do, more broadly, in response to a suffering world that cries out to be fixed. Histories of miraculous cures and incorrupt relics, bilocating mystics and levitating monks, rebel against the hegemony of positive science and resist the reduction of the rich heterogeneity of human experience to data points on a spreadsheet. Histories of spirit possession and vision quests, mind reading and ecstatic trance invite us to entertain possibilities of perception, to consider ways of knowing that far exceed the limits of the rational. Scholarship on the history of religions, at its best, generates what Jeffrey Kripal calls ontological shock, which is to say, scholarship on the history of religion, at its best, seizes us by the shoulders, shakes us awake, and urges us to look, see how much more there is than we've allowed ourselves to admit. To a world suffering from the excesses of the rational, debilitated and dulled by the banal, the predictable, and the programmatic, scholarship in the history of religions offers a vital remedy. So do not despair. Keep your little white archive gloves on and go major in religious studies and philosophy, because what we do does matter. It makes a difference. It's important, especially now. We do good, we change lives, and sometimes we even save them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dunn. We would like to open the floor for some Q&A. If you have anything you'd like to raise as a question or inquiry with our lecturer this evening. In order to capture this, so it's audible for everyone, or at least as much as possible, and to get it on the video, I'll ask you to line up behind the microphones. There's one on each side of the room in order to do so, or one can be brought around to you if need be. Just let us know. I know there's always an awkward pause as folks think about what they might want to ask. So this is an invitation to step up and raise an inquiry, or to raise your hand if you'd like the microphone to be passed your direction.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in your view of religious and in your personal life, do you believe that a more social framework of disability is more accepting to the reality of different people rather than biomedical model, or do you feel like another model of disability fits more within the Catholic perspective and
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think the cultural model of disability probably fits my own sense a little bit better. So for those of you who aren't familiar with these models, there's basically the kind of physical model, like the biomedical model, and then the social model, which essentially makes the argument that disability is a problem of the surrounding environment not being suitable for people whose bodies don't fit the norm. And some of the critiques of that model I do find resonate with me. I mean, in some ways, that the social model of disability also ignores the kind of recalcitrant physical and bodily facts of physical and mental, just embodied difference. The cultural model, which I think does a better job of bridging the kind of divide between the biomedical model and the social model, at once calling societies and cultures to task for accommodating disability and at the same time reckoning with bodies is probably more closer to my own sense of where we should be. Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Hi again.
Thank you for your talk. I like how you interpret the question.
Yeah.
Using the word disability
Yeah. Yeah.
Paints this biomedical narrative like a lack.
Yes. Yes.
or delay the word carries
With people to reclaim it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. As we talked about a little bit earlier today, I think, baked into the etymology of disability is this sense of lack. Something's missing. We want to re-able. Hence the therapies and the treatments and the interventions, surgical and otherwise. Perhaps we might move away from it, but the way I've seen it now is that disability scholars and disability activists have embraced that term. And I don't know, I'm sure others in the room know more than I do about this. I'm not sure where that discussion is in the field right now, but I haven't heard too much about that, except to say that we have moved away from, certainly, disabled people and toward people with disabilities for obvious reasons. But I agree, Owen. I think that there's a baked-in normative judgment in that term itself. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Dunn.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Yeah.
One question I had for you was about, at one point in your talk, you talked about how the Catholic classes think that you've done better. And you talked
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
the relation between suffering and disability. I wanted to ask you a question on two different strands.
Yeah.
One is like the idea of how Catholic Church is orientation and predisposition towards suffering is almost at times a precondition of safety.
Yeah.
If you could
Yeah.
maybe articulate a little bit more, like your own view on that, of where do we draw a particular bright line of how much suffering, I guess, is permissible in relation to the kind of intervention that you're articulating.
Yeah.
And especially in the context of how you had used this language of how people have their suffering sort of pressing down on their lives. And I think we're seeing a lot of the structural effects, especially when you kind of implicate towards the end of your talk the maybe contemporary implications of your advocacy or call to action. The second strand I wanted to ask you about is about the Catholic tradition in church itself. So if you look at, for example, the sacrament of like healing the sick, I feel like there's a kind of vertical relation and hierarchy that's maybe mirrored in Sister Rose's story or is maybe built into the way that the Catholic Church is structured itself. So I was curious if you could maybe articulate and maybe defend the idea of like searching into Catholic or ecclesiastic traditions as interpretive resources and how that might be constrained by the Catholic Church's hierarchy, and maybe that reduces and mitigates the kind of ontological shock that's generated
Yeah.
as a result of that.
That's such a great question. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, two questions. Suffering and the institutional church and its hierarchy. Yeah, so suffering, that is a tricky question. There's probably a lot I could say about that particular problem. Catholics are often accused of glorifying suffering, and in many cases, the lives of the saints do precisely that. The example I gave of Benedict Lebray, certainly. The example I gave of Kateri Tekakwitha, same sort of story. And when I get back to suffering, one of the things I find so interesting about the question of disability in the lives of the saints is the way in which the almost imperative to heal disability in the miracle stories of the lives of the saints runs smack into this kind of glorification of disability and the imputed suffering that goes along with it in these Catholic narratives of saints' lives. So that, I think, is an interesting tension. I I think that the Catholic Church deserves a lot of critique for the glorification of suffering, and yet also in thinking about the disability scholars term of TAB, temporarily able-bodied, I mean, one might also say something similar of suffering. It is just like the universal human lot. And so in some ways, we might not want to adopt those narratives as our own, but the mere possibility that there's a way of thinking about suffering in a way that's generative and not diminishing is, I think, one of the vital resources in the Catholic tradition. I don't know, necessarily think we want to go as far as the Catholic Church does or the Catholic tradition does in its glorification of suffering, but the suggestion that there may be something that we can glean from those experiences is, I think, very helpful. And in terms of the institutional church, that's also an excellent question. And Sister Rose, I mean, this, you have to remember that that dossier with all those 21 miracles in it, including Sister Rose, was going to be forwarded to Rome in support of Didas Pelletier's canonization. So this like deference that's being represented in the document to the institutional church was front and center. There's so much in the Catholic history that happens on the penumbra of all of that, and these kind of unorthodox, unsanctioned practices of disability can still provide like far more ontological shock than a story like that. For example, I don't know if anybody has ever been to, there are tons of Catholic shrines one might be able to go to, but I'm thinking specifically of St. Anne de Beaupré in Quebec. It's about 30 minutes outside of Quebec City. And when you go there, yes, it's a church, but there are all of these, all kinds of votives. We call them ex votos. These like little material trinkets or representations of healings or cures that have happened and that people have attributed to the intercession of St. Anne, whose shrine this is. There are crutches, there are burn masks, all kinds of things. And it's just those, I think that gives you a great indication of just some of the practices that happen outside of the penumbra, or outside of like the core of the Catholic Church in these kind of penumbral areas that are then brought into the church. So I think there's still plenty there if we know where to look, more in the kind of lived religion category than in some of these official documents. But thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing your It resonated a lot with my own life experience. And that's kind of where my question, which is again around the idea of the suffering body, focuses on. And what I really enjoyed about your presentation was, you know, even as you're talking about the disability as signifying something greater, in this case, the saint, or the soon-to-be canonized saint, there's still these other stories where, like, you know, where like mortification is, particularly with saints, like especially the early church fathers, mortification is also kind of a sign of divinity, right? A sign of excellence. But I wonder, so like with autism, there's a whole discourse of autism that talks about autistic superpowers, right? Where it's almost like an overcorrection. Because it has been a negative issue for so long. There's no progression of it as a superpower. And I wonder if stories like this, where we start looking at disability not as a problem to be fixed, but as something pointing to God, particularly, are we running the risk of that same type of autistic superpower kind of discourse?
Yeah, and that's a great question and a wonderful point, and I agree with everything you said. And there's also the risk, too, of, in the story of Sister Rose and disability pointing to God, as making it mean anything, like, and being useful for somebody else. So, yeah, I think that's a real liability. Absolutely. And for me, and that's why in the book, I'm careful not to like adopt or glorify any of those narratives, but simply to say the difference, like the fact that they are different, that there are alternatives is just so, and that we may then be able to do something else that's completely new, that is neither like, attaching disability to sin or glorifying disability as the sign that points to God, that we might find like a third and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth way to think through these things. That's what's so life-giving about those things. But I completely agree with that. There's that, I don't know if you guys read Bob Orsi in your classes at all, but there's this beautiful chapter in his book, Between Heaven and Earth, where he talks about Uncle Sal. Yeah, it's a great one. Uncle Sal has MS, I believe, and it's a critique. This is a chapter that is like the critique of Uncle Sal and his experience as somebody with MS being trotted out in these kind of like Catholic weekend events to like get the prayers and kind of give the blessings to others. So there is certainly that strand that I think is just as maleficent. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
What I most wanted to ask here follows on your invitation to the archive and your
Yes.
invitation to
Yeah.
more folks to pursue archival work,
Ooh, yeah.
which I love doing.
Yeah.
So I appreciate the invitation. But I also wanted to raise up that of all the spaces that I've been in an academic context, archives tend to be, they're the place after which my body hurts the most. For example, they tend to be the least actually accessible to disabled bodies, right? And to disabled scholars. So I wonder, when you think about, you can't bring any food in, you can't bring any drink in, you sit there for hours or you stand there for hours, and there's the physical requirements and how the rooms are constructed. I mean, there's so much lack of thought
Yeah.
to disabled scholars coming into that space to do this sort of work, and I wondered if you could reflect a little on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. You were bringing back all kinds of
Memories.
all kinds of memories. Yeah, the thirst, like yeah, totally. I mean, the first thing that occurs to me is simply like what digitization affords, and I think that's been just tremendous in terms of access and opening up access, and then just the idea of how do we expand access to the archives? Also, the notion that there may be, for those things that aren't available digitized yet, oftentimes archivists are willing and able to do some preliminary research. I mean, if anyone is interested and unable to access an archive, make friends with the archivist. I mean, I think that can be, archivists can really do a lot of work in enabling and improving access to their holdings. But yeah, I mean, archives are the most notoriously closed and difficult places to be, for sure. Yeah, thank you for that. Oh, yes.
Hi there. I'm my name's Claire. I'm not at all like a disability scholar. I have no impressive credentials about this. I do have some personal experience. My older brother has, I guess what we kind of classify as pretty significant special needs. I'm the president of Special Olympics Club. Here on campus, I'm studying international service. And something I've noticed with academia and higher education that's been so frustrating to me when I've been studying, my emphasis is human rights. I learn a lot about different ethnic minorities. I learn a lot about women. I learn a lot about children. I learn about basically every minority group under the sun, and I learn about people who have physical disabilities. But in my time, the thing I have found consistently that is missing from my education is human rights. I know do not international studies. This is a question. Human rights and scholarly research on people with intellectual disabilities, as not only the subject of human rights atrocities, but daily life. And so I see that you conducted research on that. I think that's really cool. But how do you, as a non-disabled scholar, go about researching people that oftentimes cannot physically even tell you their own story or their own experience?
Thank you, Claire. That's a great question. So I will say, understand that the disability studies community kind of recognizes that that has been an issue. Even in the scholarship, there's so much disability studies scholarship that tends to connect to physical disabilities, and that intellectual disabilities have been, by and large, kind of ignored. I think some of that is changing, and that's a really interesting history in and of itself. There's a wonderful book. I will give a shout out to a colleague at University of Georgia, wonderful book coming out in the area of intellectual disability and 20th century American Catholic history, called The Exceptional Body of Christ by Andrew Walker Cornetta. And it's just, when I read it for the first time as a peer reader, I'm announcing, it was just like being thirsty and drinking water. I mean, it's just so necessary, and he does such a beautiful job with it. I will say, I think your question is making me think, so a lot of what I do, is 17th, 18th century stuff in Canada, where there are indigenous communities, and I was explaining to a couple of your peers over tea today that the very few resources we have, the textual resources we have from this time period, are from the French. They're from the Jesuits, they're from these nuns, they're from some of the colonial habitants, the settlers, and we don't really have much from the indigenous community. So there is some kind of parallel there. How do you write? How do you represent the unrepresented? It's a wonderful question. And I think, the human rights angle is a really interesting one. So I have to give a response. So it's a great question. How would I respond? I always tend to go back to the imagination. Like, there's something so universally human about all of us. Of course, we have different experiences and different backgrounds and all kinds of differences. But there are also, I think, some of what academia lost sight of, in recent generations, was the universality of some of human experience, and we're coming back to that just a little bit with some of the newer literature and critiques coming out. But there is something like it's not impossible to do your best to empathetically and imaginatively try to be in somebody else's shoes. And I think, with the experience of people with intellectual disabilities, perhaps, from an ethnographic perspective, being, in the present day, spending time and being with is the biggest thing. I can't do that with my historical subjects, but I can, I can move around in their worlds, those bygone worlds, as best I can, and piece things together as best I can, and really imagine, what would this have been like? Do I have an experience of alienation? Do I have an experience of illness? What might this have felt like? So, thank you. Yeah.
Hi. Sorry. So you mentioned that the Catholic past wasn't better, and what does better actually mean, in that context? Are we talking about levels of devotion or moral behavior, institutional power, and is that even possible to measure that in a meaningful way?
Well, when I say better, in that context, I meant simply, we wouldn't necessarily want to adopt those disability stories as our own and live them. Mm-hmm. Does that make living easier? Does that better represent the reality of living with a disability? Does that better kind of humanize the experience of living with a disability? I don't think it does. So that's what I meant by that. Thank you. Hi. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So stigmata, for those of you who don't know, is a Catholic, what would we say, like a tradition or a feature, an element in some lives of the certain saints where they are said to have the wounds of Christ on their hands. St. Francis of Assisi is a great example of somebody who suffered the stigmata. So I think that's a really interesting example of just getting back to Catherine of St. Augustine, whose life story is told by her hagiographer as basically one that's just another version of the suffering Christ who suffers for others in service of others. This suffering is done for the sake of saving a sinful Canada in her story. And so, so I think that's what the stigmata are doing. You'll never have a story of stigmata that are undesirable. Stigmata are intensely desirable in the Catholic hagiographic tradition. And in a sense, they go back to more of an idea that there's this, signs pointing to God, disability in those cases being signs pointing to God. There's a famous book written quite a while ago by Nancy Eisland about the disabled Christ. And it's a theological interpretation of disability from a Christian perspective. But I think that that would be an instance in which I would say, okay, so there's a story of disability being used as an example of imitation of Christ and intimacy with Christ, in a way that kind of points to the more of the superpower narrative, for better or worse. Thank you.
So I was asking a twofold methodological question about your book, Where Paralytics Walk and the Blind See. You mentioned in page, I believe it's 15, you talked about how, there we go, historians, we need to do a much better job of arguing and about reach the line between past and present. So I was asking about history. Have you encountered difficulties of that within like the field of history? Because I know there is there's a certain reluctance about adopting.
Right.
I'm trying to see that blend. Century here, and building off of that, to you to expand on your notion of like the encounter that you talked about here, the encounter between past and present, and what that entailed to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Well, so I think that maybe the most easy way to get into that question is just to say, of course historians are thinking about their own questions when they approach their work. I've thought a lot about this, and I've written a lot about this. For such a long time, historians have operated under, and scholars of religious studies as well, which is really, dear to my heart. That's my training. We have operated with this presumption that we need to keep our subjects at arm's length. Like that is, if we keep them here, then we can see them as they really are. You get too close, you risk reading your own story and your own context into theirs, and you get too close and your vision is blurry, basically, is the idea. And there was, I think a lot of this, especially in religious studies, has to do with the paranoia a lot of scholars of religion have not to be misidentified as theologians. So, like if we get too close to our subjects and if we are too intimate with them, then we're not objective observers. And we too might imperil our professional credentials by becoming too close. So I think that's a bunch of baloney, in part because there is inevitably we are drawn to our subjects because things have happened to us, or we have questions of our own that come out of the context of our daily lives, and that's why we're drawn to our subjects. All of us do, and if we don't admit that, we're hiding it. And some people will even say there's a particular danger in not fessing up to that, because then you're masquerading as an objective observer when really you do have these interests at stake. So that's one thing I would say. And then the other thing I would say to that question in terms of like encounter, you know, getting back to Claire's question earlier, how do we come to understand our subjects other than by really trying to get close to them? By really trying to, like looking in great detail at the intimate parts of their lives, by trying to stand in their shoes, by actually trying to get close to them. So, you know, I think there's a real friction in the discipline of history between empathy, which, you know, in the book I talk about empathy as a tool in the historian's toolbox, and there's plenty of literature that precedes me on this. But then there's also this wariness about presuming we can have such empathy with our subjects because they must be so different from us. But that's what I would say about encounter. I think to really get to know our subjects in the details of their lives, we have to get close, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. And at the same time, we can respect the very real differences between our context and theirs. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. I hope that's helpful.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Sam. I'm Jewish. I just have a question.
Yeah.
So, Judaism,
Yeah.
if you get like a terminal illness
Mm.
or something happens to you that's like extraordinarily disabling, sometimes you get an extra sort of blessing added to that disability.
Mm.
Even if it may have to like inspire goodwill and hopefully make some difference in your disability. And I was wondering if there was anything like that in Catholicism or anything means that like
Yeah, that's such a great question. Not that I know of, although there are plenty of Catholic rituals kind of designed around certain, even just ailments that maybe single out for a special blessing, like a physical ritual blessing. I'm thinking of St. Blaise, throat illnesses. There's a special holiday still in the Catholic liturgical year, and people will go to receive that blessing. So there is that, but nothing not regarding naming. But yes, extra ritual blessings, I think, but only in some limited cases. And usually they're always connected to a saint. Because for those of you who maybe don't know, in Catholicism, there's a saint for everything, number one. And number two, a lot of these saints have particular specialties when it comes to disabling conditions. Yeah, thanks.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Mira, and
Yeah.
you explain more on. So first, when you introduce the term disabled, do you see it primarily as a rhetorical tool meant to build solidarity and disrupt the illusion of permanent ability, or do you see it more as a literal reframing of how we should understand embodiment? And I'm also curious how you reconcile that with some critiques from disabled scholars who argue that able-bodied people, or imply that disability is temporary for everyone.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I had not heard the latter critique. I was not aware of that. For me, well, I think what do I think they're doing? I connect that term, and perhaps there are other ways to think about it, but I connect that term especially in the context of the emerging concept of the norm, like this idea that there are, as Leonard Davis argues, that there are, people who have disabilities and they are abnormal, and there are people who don't and they are normal. To me, the term tab is meant to cut right through that and to suggest that that's a meaningless distinction in part, and that there's the inevitability of that bodies will change and that bodies will gain and lose abilities at various points in their lives, and so to break down that distinction between the able and the disabled, I think, is its primary function. But I was not aware of those critiques, so thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Hi. Yay. Right. Okay, that's a great question, and it reminds me of some really good work on disability in the medieval period. So I didn't talk at all about this, although it's in the book. Some historians will say it doesn't make any sense to talk about disability in the past. I mean, that's a very 19th century concept, and that in the past, as medieval historians have pointed out, there was no such distinction. And part of this might have been that the fact that in those times and places, impairment was a more common fact of life, and people weren't distinguishing between those with disabilities and those without. And I find that literature, that historical perspective in that literature really compelling. And so Irina Meltzer is one author, and Edward Wheatley, so two people who come to mind immediately as medieval historians who kind of critique the very notion that we can even talk about disability in the past, whether Catholic or not, simply because this is not something that was part of, the worldview, and a part of a way of categorizing humanity before the 19th century. So I found those critiques compelling. I hope that's helpful. Yeah, thanks.
Hi. Thank you for your talk. In the story you shared, I know that the doctor wasn't able to provide a cure, but there was still this emphasis on a cure through the device.
Yeah.
Do you know of any examples in the past where disability wasn't seen as like the cure was not the focus of maybe the story?
That is a good question. Those counterexamples I provided, there's so many more like it, but of, the stories in which, in some of these lives of the saints, like Benedict Labre, or Kateri Tekakwitha, or Catherine of St. Augustine, disability, the point is not the cure. The point is how disability was acquired, or what disability enabled, or what disability more broadly kind of connected to in the Catholic tradition. So there are those stories, and there are tons of them. I mean, there are plenty of them. In terms of and also, again, what I find so interesting about the lives of the saints is that on the one hand, you have this whole collection constantly of miracle stories, and I don't know of any miracle stories that celebrate a disability not being cured. They're all about, a storm was stilled, or, food was multiplied, or this person was healed of this, that, or the other. But oftentimes there is this very jarring and very thought-provoking juxtaposition of all these miracle stories that are typically tacked on to the end of a saint's life, where disability is cured, and then the saint's life itself, in which disability is acquired. These nuns at the Hôtel Dieu. Their stories are really interesting. They primarily are stories maybe more of illness or wearing oneself out through service. But one of the really interesting things I found when I was researching the Hôtel Dieu and really reading carefully their annals and their history is that when they tell stories about themselves, these nuns, they celebrate the acquisition of bodies that have, become debilitated through this, constant vigil or constant service to the sick. That is, for them, a good thing, a real index of salvation. And it always struck me as something so interesting because at the same time that they were acquiring all these bodily infirmities, they were trying to heal other people of their bodily infirmities. So it was this interesting juxtaposition.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Okay. Okay, great. Great. Hi, Jacob. Hi.
So, sorry.
Yeah.
But, imagination in my head.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
way, but also forces you to live with let you. We punish people who try to escape on their own, on their own. Yeah, so like kind of like a punishment for not adhering to normalcy, kind of just continuously creates intense and ongoing suffering in people's day-to-day lives. And so I just was curious on what your thoughts are on how discourse could evolve or will evolve to folks who are trying to imagine a different reality while trying to reckon with and live and survive, like live well, not just live, but live well in this current reality to punish you for imagining new ways of being.
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's a great question. This is where I would want to bring up something along the lines of the cultural model again of disability, or the cultural model of illness even. This idea that there are at once like obligations of the broader society and culture to accommodate and make room for differences of various kinds. And then there is like the recalcitrant fact of whether it's bodily or intellectual or mental difference, and finding a way to navigate between those two. Between those two, I think is really important, because one can't deny. I'm thinking of this really incredible book by a guy named Jonathan Rosen called Best Minds, and it is at once. It's actually a critique of. It's a beautiful book. It's a critique of kind of the almost over-enthusiastic and abundant desire to accommodate some forms of mental illness in ways that caused much more suffering. It's a story specifically about schizophrenia, and a really famous case from the 20th century, I think it was from the 1990s, that happened in New York. So I think there must be some balance. We can't, I guess in terms of the imagination, I don't want to end on a down note, but we can't imagine our way out of everything. And that's where I would say, I think we can imagine a lot. And I think the imagination is a tremendously powerful tool for creating different worlds and for experiencing our own world in more robust and rich and deep ways. And yet there are limits. And that's where, I think that's where I find myself, like somewhere in the middle between realizing that there will be difficulties and there will be hurdles. If I just think of my own daughter, for instance, we can't imagine our way out of everything. There will be struggles, and that's, we can do our best to kind of think creatively beyond them and to make them meaningful in different ways. But sometimes, the body is a hard fact sometimes. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on that, but just to say that I think somewhere in the middle is probably maybe where we have to think and imagine. Thanks, Jalen. Yeah, Roxy. Sorry.
Hi, Dr. Dunn. Thank you again. As everyone has said,
Okay.
So my question kind of stems from the figures you mentioned at the beginning on, I think, the first or second slide, that these are religious figures that have come over either to teach indigenous children or the children. And so that's where it definition of ableism that Talia A. Lewis has developed over the years. I'm just going to read it because it's done so eloquently. A system of bodies and minds based on societally constructed interests, honesty, productivity, desirability, intelligence, excellence, and fitness. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in genetics, anti-blackness, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and communism. So that's the definition of ableism that Lewis gives. And noting that your work looks at the history of that
during colonization, I'm wondering how you grapple with and engage with the colonial anti-black ideologies that are very present in these religious practices like Catholicism has. So I'm wondering if you could give thoughts on that.
Great question. I'll say, yeah, that's a great question. In the first chapter of the book, I deal with the Jesuit relations, those annual letters, journals basically, written back by the Jesuits to France. In those journals, the Jesuits talk a lot about sickness and disability. And my book treats both sickness and disability. And I didn't want, I hope this is some way of answering your question or reflecting on it. I didn't want to just report what the Jesuits were saying about people. I wanted to, and this is again where the imagination comes in, I think, I wanted to think about what would it be like the story I tell in the first chapter is of an indigenous man named Emery James. That's the name he's given in the Jesuit relations. And I report the story that the Jesuits tell of him. And then in these italicized passages, I imagine, for better or worse, there's like no right way to do it. What might his counter response have been, or what might his experience have been that the Jesuits weren't getting? They had an audience they were writing to. They had a purpose for which they were writing these relations. They had an agenda, and they were telling the story of this guy. And maybe they got some of it right, but maybe they didn't. And so in terms of the imagination, empathy, I thought to myself, I know what it's like to be sick. We all know what it's like to be sick. We've all lain in our beds and had this experience at some point. And this particular story was of a sick man, Emery James. And so I just, in great detail, tried to imagine what it must have been like and did some research into indigenous life, kind of recreating with my language, the setting he might have been in, what the weather might have been like at the time, how his home may have been constructed, where he might have been lying, what he might have been hearing. And I'm sure I got it wrong, but the point is I interrupted the Jesuit relations with that story. And again, that story that I told may not have all been what Emery James was thinking, but its presence in my book, I hope, functions to remind the reader that the Jesuits weren't getting it right, that there must have been something else. So I hope that helps a little bit. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we are just past our time. We might have a question, maybe dialogue shortly afterward. Please join me in thanking Dr. Dunn.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. You're a great audience.